Before we get into today's episode, I want to share something that's helped transform my daily routine. I've started using Bob, the refillable bottle-free body wash designed specifically for men. If you're still using bottled shower gel, you're literally washing money down the drain. Let's face it, you always use more than you need, and half of it just slips through your hands before it touches your skin. Bob combines a reusable applicator with exfoliating bristles and the world's first refillable body wash bars, formulated to match a man's skin pH of 5.5. It's better for your skin, better for your wallet, and better for the planet. For an exclusive 15% offer on your first order, head over to welcometobob.com and use the code meaningofmen15 at checkout. Welcome back to The Meaning of Men. I'm your host, Simeon Atkins, and today we're focusing the conversation on boys and young men. Why are so many young men struggling with their identity, purpose, and connection? Have we lost sight of what healthy masculinity really looks like? And where do fathers, mentors, and male role models fit in? To help unpack this and more, I'm joined by Andrew Reiner, author of Better Boys, Better Men. We dive into the pressures many boys are facing, the impact of the boy code, and how we can support them in becoming strong, grounded men. Andrew brings some fascinating insights, challenging some common narratives and offering a fresh perspective on what young men really need. Let's get into it. Andrew, give me a couple of sentences on the journey of your career and what it's exposed you to.
Sure. My story basically has been one that I think a lot of men can identify with, which is um, growing up feeling that the wardrobe didn't fit me. And by that, what I mean is that the literally and figuratively, what we expect boys and men to wear in terms of, the wardrobe they're allowed to put on is very limited. And I say that literally as well, because when you go into stores for clothing for children, you're going to have a much easier time finding a selection for girls than you will for boys. So it goes literally and figuratively. And so I was one of these kids growing up who, because of some things that happened early in my life, was very aware of the ways that I was expected to behave as a boy. I shouldn't say behave, but act as a boy, that just didn't really feel like they at all resonated with who I was and who I wanted to be. And so this was always on my radar. And so throughout my life as a young adult, later as an adult, I went through a couple different stages. I call them these reckonings, where I went through these kinds of big transformations. And what it ultimately was, Simeon, was really drilling down more and more to becoming the kind of boy and eventually man that I really wanted to be. It's really been, a journey of authenticity. It really is.
What is the mission that you're striving for with the work that you're doing?
I would say the mission that I'm really striving for is, there are definitely a few of them. One of them, and this one comes through in my first book, Better Boys, Better Men. One of my missions is unequivocally, um, I want boys and men of all ages, assuming they're open to these messages, I want them to experience the kind of liberation that I've experienced in my quest to be as authentic as I can be, as a man and as a human. And so that's been, I know that that's a lot. That's a big bite, to take off, but that's really what I'm trying to do in my first book, Better Boys, Better Men. I am constantly trying to help, older boys and men who read it see ways that they can take off, these yokes that they've been forced to wear that don't feel like they fit, this wardrobe that doesn't fit them, to get back to that metaphor, and to really develop a masculinity, a sense of masculine identity that aligns more with who they are, that they know that they can create their own wardrobe with it. Um, Another part of it for me and my mission since my first book is now what I'm working on with my next book, and that mission is especially helping older boys and young men to find ways to develop their resiliency, because there is such a dearth of that amongst so many boys and young men today. And, this is something that is really glaring in the States, but it's actually something that's happening in all OECD countries, and the numbers bear that out. And just to give you one example, there have been recent studies that show that in OECD countries that boys are falling through the crack in education. Now, what that is that's not just that, what happens in schools is reflective of other things that are going on for boys. Education is just the place that we see it really showing up glaringly.
It's interesting because I'm listening to this, and I'm sure people will be the same. I'm a man, and I have a son as well, and so I'm thinking about this and processing this for both myself, but also my young son who's just turned 3 as well. And what I'm really looking forward to is hearing about the journey that boys go through in adolescence, and obviously then the impact that has on as men, because it'll be fascinating really to see those two ends of the spectrum really from a personal standpoint, but I'm sure for people that are listening as well. You mentioned there about the book Better Boys, Better Men. What was the inspiration specifically around writing that book?
Well, there's two parts to this. One is how it happened, which is that really the book would not have happened had I not written a piece for the New York Times that ended up going viral, and it got a lot of attention. But in terms of where the book really came from, you spoke to having a 3-year-old son. For me, it was very much the birth of my son. Um, I was teaching this course I created in the Honors College at the university where I teach, and the course is called The Changing Face of Masculinity. And as much as I was teaching this course and really finding interest in it, there was something missing when I was teaching the course. And what I realized after my son was born was that I was holding back in the course. What I was doing was giving a course that I thought the students that would be interesting for them and a little bit to think about, but that it wouldn't challenge them too much in too many ways. What I was holding back on was the topic of vulnerability, of emotional honesty. I was holding back from that because I thought, oh, they're not going to get it. They're going to laugh at it. They're going to get turned off by this with men. And when my son was born, it was a reckoning for me. There's been like 2 or 3 reckonings in my life. This was the most recent one when my son was born. Because what happened was when he was born, all the baggage that I had and all the angst from, so much about this idea of masculinity and a masculine identity and what it means, so much of my own baggage around that topic. And growing up, to be honest with you, I had like a pitched battle, with that topic. It was something I pushed back against a lot. And so having, the son being born suddenly made me look at all the preconceptions that I had, all of the resentment that I had, and it made me really think about what is it that you really would want for your son without imposing too much on him, but wanting him to become, the best version of, assuming he identifies as male, assuming, the best version of himself that he can be and that he wants to be. And so that really got me thinking. And I know this sounds crazy, but this is all going through my head when he's a baby. Because all this stuff was on my radar already. And so, when he's born, I am just, like lying awake at night, all these things are going through my mind. And so when I got the opportunity to write this book, I wanted it to be really, as much as it really is for other boys and other men, you know, it the it's not a coincidence that at the end of the book I put letter to my son, because it's really a letter, Simeon, that could go out, and I try to frame it in a way that, well, a lot of it, especially the last part of it, could go out to all boys and men. And I even say that at the end. But it really is about my son and about what I want for him.
What do you mean when you talk about vulnerability? I think most people have an idea in their head of what the definition of vulnerability is, but I'd really like to unpick when it comes to boys and men and when it comes to masculinity. What do you mean when you're talking about vulnerability specifically?
Sure. Let me just say at the outset, one of the things that I do when I teach this masculinity course, and actually some of my other courses, is I'll say, you know, when you think of the word vulnerability, what one word or words comes to mind? And you're not going to be surprised to hear this. They always say weakness.
Hmm.
So when we talk about vulnerability, we're very much talking about an uphill battle, trying to get boys and men especially, but even increasingly girls and young women to be okay with this idea of vulnerability, to understand that it's a much bigger picture. There's much more to this word than we like to really believe it's about. Because vulnerability, right off the bat, when you're looking at something as a weakness, that is a giant obstacle to trying to get people on board with the idea of saying, oh, you should be more vulnerable. Why wouldn't anybody want to be more vulnerable if they're terrified they're going to be perceived as having a target on their back, right? So one of the things that is really difficult to do, but I try to unpack it in my book, is helping to understand what vulnerability can look like, that it's not just about crying. Vulnerability has, just like buying a soda in the store, it can be extra, it can be small, medium, large, or extra large. There's all these different forms of vulnerability. It's not just this one big act that makes us feel incredibly mortified, like crying. Vulnerability can be something as simple as going up to somebody and saying, you know what? When I went off on you yesterday and I started getting really angry, I'm really sorry about that. Apologizing, believe it or not, I mean, that really is a lower level form of vulnerability. To take that a step higher, to go back and to tell somebody not only to apologize, but to say, when I really got angry at you, you know, I wasn't really being honest with you or myself about what it was that was really beneath my anger. One of the things that I learned as a parent when my son was really young was that I had to walk the talk. That if I was going to talk about the need to be vulnerable, I had to model it. And so one of the things that I would teach myself to do is that when I would get upset with my son for something he did that was really endangering him, his safety, I would go back and I would say to him, number one, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I got so upset with you about that. And I'm sure it scared you. And I would say to him, but let me tell you what was really beneath my anger. What was beneath my anger in this instance was I was afraid that what you were doing, you were very quickly and easily going to get really hurt badly by this. So I was really afraid for you. And that's what was really beneath all of my anger. And so that's a really good example too. That's like a package deal, right? Of vulnerability. And so those are some examples, small examples of vulnerability. But this is going to sound crazy, but here's another really small example of vulnerability that's even easier than the two I just described. So often when we're out in a store and we see like somebody drop something, if a female drops it, a girl, a woman, an older woman, we're much more likely as guys to rush up and to help them and to pick it up. If we see another guy do it, we're probably not going to do it, especially if he's older. If he's a boy, we might do it. If he's an older guy, no. Because what we're thinking in our mind is, he wouldn't want me to do it. I'm not going to make this guy feel uncomfortable and embarrassed, so I'm not going to do that. That is more about us than it is about them. Because when we really get down to it, when we all are out in the world, even those of us that think that we are, that we're walking around, armored, we all want to know that if push comes to shove and something happens and we are vulnerable, we'd like to know that some stranger would have our back. Everybody would like to know that. And so if we understand that, then what that means is that, it's okay to go and help another guy. It's okay to hold open a door for another guy. It's okay to help him pick up those cans that he just dropped in the store, because it's more about us than it is about them. And so that's a really small form of vulnerability that a lot of guys don't think of, but it is a form of vulnerability, because you're extending yourself and you're making yourself open to rejection or to judgment. That's vulnerability.
Got me thinking actually of something that happened to me at the weekend. So I was in central London with my daughter Ellen and had the pram, and I was going to a tube station, and it was one of the stations that didn't have a lift, so I had to take the stairs. And because I was on my own and there were very steep stairs, like I did need some help. I probably could have got away with it, but having some help definitely was preferable. And I wouldn't say it took long, but like there was a few guys that walked past and looked and just carried on. And then eventually a guy helped me down the stairs. But I wonder if it had been my wife, whether those other men would have walked past, whether they would have automatically gone to help. So that was quite interesting. And I guess what you're saying there is that those small acts of vulnerability, if you can sort of master those and get comfortable with them, then you'll get comfortable with potentially the bigger acts of vulnerability, if you like.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. One of the things that I've been working with myself on, I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but because it's something that I want to keep building on. One of the things that I've been building on myself are having more of my emotional needs met in my marriage. Because when I went into counseling with my wife, one of the things I realized was that I was not asking for what my needs were. My wife was great about asking for what she wanted in the relationship, right? You're smiling because you know what I'm talking about. Most guys do. But I was never asking for what I wanted because I thought I can handle this. I've got this, right? I can handle this. I don't really have any needs. Bullshit. We all have emotional needs. And one of the things that happens when we withhold those needs is we get resentful. We start getting resentful, we start getting pissed off, and we start projecting our anger and our resentment onto other things. And our partner looks at us like, where's this coming from? Why are you getting so worked up about this? And what a lot of guys don't realize, it's because other things, other needs that they have, or this is an example of a kind of a trigger need that they have, they're not getting met. And so it's manifesting in these much more ineffective ways that can be really deleterious. But that's an example, of learning when at a certain point you say, you know what, I do have emotional needs. And this is going to help me, and it's going to help the people I love around me in the long run. And so that's an example of, working up to that, because it really is a process of learning to feel comfortable being in your own skin. It really is. And then so that, the more we do that, the more we can get more comfortable. It gets easier the more you do it with these bigger forms of vulnerability. Absolutely.
Hi everyone, I want to take a moment to shout out Apex Everest, an incredible organisation and partner of the show who are pushing the limits of human resilience. Imagine this, climbing the equivalent of Mount Everest, but right here in the UK, by summiting the Helvellyn mountain 9 times in just 48 hours. But Apex isn't just about the challenge, it's the chance to be part of a year-round, vibrant community dedicated to unlocking your true potential. Whether you're looking to push your own limits or you're part of a team wanting to build an unshakable bond, this experience will stick with you for life. So if you're ready to conquer your Everest and be part of something special, check out apexeverest.com to find out more. In the book, you talk about the boy code. I'd really love to dive into what that is and fundamentally how it impacts boys' mental health.
The boy code is, very much what we all know that, the code is for guys, right? Boys understand at a young age, very much younger than we realize. Boys understand at a young age that it's a sign of failure if they have to ask for help. And that is something boys learn at a much younger age, like I was saying, than we realize. That's a really big one, because that has a lot more repercussions than a lot of other things that are part of this code, which is true, again, for older boys and men too. But that's a really big one. Understanding that if they're going to prove their competency as boys, as ascending men, they have to do things on their own, and they really should be asking for help. And the other one is that you want to make sure that you're looking like you've got things under control. And keep in mind, these are not things that a lot of boys would necessarily be aware of consciously, but it's something that they're socialized with. And so another thing that's part of that code is a lot of boys understand that when they're around friends or they're just around peers, that they don't, they want to come off looking invulnerable. They don't want to look like they want to say or do anything that's going to make them open to ridicule or to judgment. Now, it's true, absolutely true, that girls have that same social anxiety There's a lot of social anxiety that's part of this. There's no question about it. Girls have it. The difference with girls is that in certain places, they understand the value of pushing through that fear to do what they need to do to succeed. And I'll give you a really good example. So socially, girls have the same anxiety that boys do about looking invulnerable. It's more common with boys, but to some extent, girls today also have it because they're afraid of appearing vulnerable too. And social media is really where that starts. Um, but what happened? A place that the girls get past this is a great example of school, because I mean, you go up and down the spectrum of developmental levels, and this is the case from in the States we call it elementary school. I think you call it grammar or grade school, all the way through university. It is far more likely for girls to raise their hand to be part of conversations and to ask questions during class. It is far less likely for guys to do the same thing. And that has a lot to do with that carryover of not wanting to feel like they're going to say or do something that's going to make them look that's going to make them look vulnerable. That's going to make them look open to judgment, to ridicule, to looking bad, to looking like they may not know the answer, that they may get it wrong. And when the girls get into spaces that have to do with their success, they let that go. They are far more likely and more comfortable to ask questions and be wrong because they're not afraid of taking what I call as a healthy risk. Girls get that. Boys still don't get that, because that's one of the things I talked about a little bit in my first book, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that in my second book, which is that this lack of resiliency and this goes across the board for boys. They are far more willing to do poorly in school because they don't want to risk appearing like they're not in control and that they don't have it together. So these are just two really the most common examples of the boy code. You could go on for other things. Don't seem like a sissy. Don't cry. Don't be too needy. But these are the two really most common ones. The fear of asking for help, and the feeling that they always need to appear like they've got everything under control, because that covers a lot of bases for these other parts of the boy code.
I want to focus for a bit on mothers, and I'm very close with my mum, and she's been a huge influence in my own life. From your experience, what role have you seen mothers playing in shaping their sons' understanding of masculinity, particularly? Because as we've been saying, this is such a polarizing topic for boys and men. How can mothers help with that?
So to answer the first part, historically, this won't come as a surprise. Mothers have been very much a counterbalance to a lot of kind of traditional masculinity from fathers. Mothers have been the ones that historically have shown much more empathy, much more compassion, much more tenderness to boys. And to me, it's no coincidence that when, for instance, during wars, there's always these stories of young men in battles and in wars, and when they get horribly injured or they're dying, they call out for their mothers tragically. And that has nothing to do with the mother. It's everything that the mothers did that was right. Because sadly, these horribly injured, young men are calling out for their mothers, because it's going back to an extremely primal need at that moment, right? Survival and pain. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they're not calling out for their fathers almost always when you hear these stories from soldiers. Um, and it's also not a coincidence, I think, that so often when men are older and they lose their mothers, they are much more broken up emotionally than they are about their fathers. And it's not that a lot of men don't have good relationships with their fathers, but again, when you have a parent who is giving you at a very young formative age much more of the emotional support, and they're meeting much more of the emotional needs that you have, very core emotional needs at a very young age, that's imprinting and it doesn't change. And so if fathers are not doing that, then the message that boys are getting, as historically they almost always have, is that my mother is the one who really, in a sense, almost loved me the most because of the kind of love that she gave me. And that is not something historically that anywhere near a balance of fathers have given sons. And so, in terms of mothers, to get to the second part of your question, in terms of mothers and what they can be for boys, um, I think that that mothers already are still those things for boys. They are still a source of nurturing and emotional support, and so many boys know that they can go to their moms for that. For my money, what is more important is having fathers feeling like they can show up and they can share in that and they can be part of that just as much. Um, when my son was born, that was something I was really locked in on. I was damn well sure that I was going to work really hard to make sure that our son had two parents he could go to when he needed all that emotional nurturing and support, so that at a very young age he could know that it can come from a man and a woman. And and so I think a lot of mothers already get it and they already know it. I think the challenge for women is much harder for single mothers. And of course, we know that there's a lot more single parents than there used to be. But I feel like I would kick myself for not saying this. I think the onus right now is more on fathers. That we really need to show up in ways that our sons really do need us to show up. I don't mean for this to sound too emotive, but one of the things my son does is he sleepwalks a lot. And sometimes he comes in the room and he's like calling out. And the fact that sometimes he might be calling out for me, even though it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't feel like getting my ass up out of bed. The fact that he's calling out for me, there's some part of that makes me feel like I'm doing my job the way that I should. But I do think that single mothers, I think it's much more difficult for single mothers today. We're in a place now, Simeon, where the mainstream kind of masculine ideals have shifted more back towards very kind of hyper masculine ideals. And we see this a lot in social media, right? We see it's all over YouTube. And we went through a period that had a long tail from like the late 60s, well into like the early 2000s, where masculinity we still had a lot of hyper masculinity, but there was a counterbalance to that. There was also a lot of, younger men, especially, who, we're trying to find a different way of being a man. And we're kind of shifting now for a lot of different socio-political reasons, cultural reasons, and you see this with a lot of younger men, they're embracing a more hyper masculine ideal. And I don't think it's a coincidence that our politics is reflecting that. And so I think that is actually made it harder for a lot of single mothers, because it makes it feel like, I can only do so much. I'm doing my best, but it's like I was saying earlier, when our sons walk out those doors, we can only hope and pray that the messages we've been giving to them are really going to give them second thought before they jump in and into actions and words that we wouldn't really support.
That's a really interesting point. Would you have any advice for single mothers that might be feeling that way?
Yeah, and there's nothing easy about this. But one of the things that's really important, and this isn't surprising, is that boys do need positive role models. And so if there is if a mother has a brother who's an uncle, who does seem like there are some positive attributes that he could share, lean a little bit more on family members, male family members, who could step in maybe a little bit more than they might be willing to kind of, to be with the son and to do things and to be, through that process, imparting things that also reinforce some of the values that the mother has. And if a mother doesn't have access to that, sometimes in certain areas, especially in big cities, there are places where there are kind of clubs for kids. And in the States, they used to call them boys and girls clubs. And a lot of times, they would be places, where kids could go after school because there might be one parent who's working, and they could be around positive role models in those kinds of places. And at the very least, having our sons involved in some kind of activities outside of school, whether it's sports, maybe it's drama, maybe it's chess or fencing or whatever it is. But having our son involved in things where there are some positive role models that are male, that we have some degree of trust in, that we feel like they can impart some positive messages too.
We were talking about some of the throwaway comments earlier, like "man up," for example, or "don't cry," etc. I'd be very curious to know what those kind of throwaway comments, the impact that they can have on a man's ability to process their emotions when they grow up. Like, what is the long-term impact of that?
Sure. It's funny when a lot of us hear those terms, we kind of like smirk and think, oh, it's such a dated, ridiculous term to say, and yet they're still very common, and they have a profound effect on boys at a very young age, especially because boys, even though girls may hear them to some extent, they're not nearly as likely to hear them repetitively as boys are still to this day. And boys are hearing them not just from peers, they're hearing them from teachers as well. When a teacher's, one of the things that when I was doing research for my first book, I found is that there are a lot of very well-meaning teachers out there with younger boys who are largely female, the teachers, who might say things to boys like, oh, come on, don't cry, chin up. They're doing it because they want to help. And they're doing it because, they surely don't want the boy, to be subject to ridicule, which he will be if he's, crying openly in class, when he's out on the playground. But there's also a degree of discomfort on the part of a lot of the adults, even females that work with boys. And because some of them are uncomfortable with males who show that kind of degree of emotion, even if they're very young. And I'm not saying a lot of teachers do, but it's more common than we might realize. That's what I'm saying. And so boys are getting these messages, not just from peers, but they're also getting them from adults. And they have an incredible imprint. One of the things, if you say to young men or to men, what do you remember that you were told that really hurt you when you were young? Almost always boys and young men can remember these things. Boys don't cry, man up. Suck it up is a big one that we use in the States. Or something as obvious as stop crying. But those kinds of messages, which a lot of parents and teachers and coaches think that they're trying to do their best by the boys, are deeply imprinting and shaming. And that's the thing that ultimately we really need to be thinking about and looking at is the effect of the shame. Because when boys receive those messages, what they are feeling inside is shame. And boys who are ashamed often grow into men who act out on their shame. And they act out on their shame in ways that really try to overcompensate for the shame that they had as boys, and they often do it in ways that they think will make them appear hypermasculine or incredibly masculine. And that often leads to a lot of violence and a history of violence. You go to any prison, I don't care what country you're in, and if you're able to get some of these men, who are in these prisons to talk about, go back into their history and to find out, where a lot of these violent impulses started, almost always it starts from places of shame. It's the messages that they got as boys.
I'd never really thought about those terms being used to try and help boys, essentially, because coming from like a well-meaning place, I suppose, which is equally damaging as much as trying to belittle boys as well. Men that have been raised with traditional masculine ideals, potentially from these throwaway comments, let's say, how can they start to unlearn some of these more damaging behaviors?
The ways that they can unlearn them often is not something that they can do on their own. And I say that because a lot of times, a lot of boys and men aren't aware of the messages that they were told. Usually men become aware of them when they're older, but a lot of boys and young men aren't necessarily aware of them unless there's been somebody that has really been making them more conscious and aware of the impact of such messages, and trying to help them to open that pipeline to their deeper, emotional lives. And so, one of the best things we can do with boys and men, um, is, we can't stop other people from saying things, that are going to be damaging to them. What we can do, though, and I know I keep using this term, but what we can do is act as a counterbalance. What we can do is counter those messages with messages that tell them and remind them, that not only is it okay to show different emotions, but if and when they're able and willing, it's good for them to be able to process them, to learn how to get in touch with them. One of the things that often happens with a lot of boys as they become men is they develop something that psychologists call alexithymia, which is this inability to access and speak to your emotions. I have an old friend. I've been friends with this guy for decades. I mean, going back to childhood. And I always thought of him as one of my few friends that could talk a little bit about his emotional life. And he has a gambling addiction. And he went down to a rehabilitation center for about 3 weeks. And he came back, and I said to him, "So what was the big takeaway for you?" And he said, "You know what? I never knew that how unin touch with my emotions I was." And I thought that speaks volumes right there. And that is true for so many men, because what he didn't realize was that when he was experiencing either small triggers of past trauma or anxiety or stress or depression, when things would trigger this, he would turn to something like gambling to try to get that quick fix, which is something a lot of men do. They turn to different things. And so, again, we can't control what goes on outside, but what we can do is help boys feel that it's safe. And that's a really important thing. Teaching boys and men that it is safe to access that pipeline to their emotions. Because a lot of boys and men don't realize that they have permission. And I can go into endless stories about young men I've interviewed for my books who realized they didn't think that they had permission to feel the things that they really were feeling. And so that's a really important place to start, is just by, talking with boys, about, helping them to understand that it's good, it's healthy, and it's okay to have the feelings they have, and to not minimize them, and to let them feel them. And if they feel like they need to be alone because they might be ashamed to have these feelings, let them do that. Some of the most important things we can do with little boys when they're having or even boys who are adolescent, when they're having big feelings, is to say to them, I understand you're going through a lot right now. And if they tell you what caused it, you could say, I'd feel the same way if something like that happened to me. Acknowledging that and letting them know that, that it's okay to have those feelings. So you're validating the feeling, but you can also say, you know what? Are you ready to talk about it? Okay, you're not. If you just need some space, just know that I'm here. That is as simple as that is. What that does is it validates the emotions, doesn't minimize them in any way. Lets boys know that they're entitled to have feelings, which is a huge gift for males. And it also lets them know, if and when you're ready, my door is open. That is something a lot of boys and men don't have, open doors to discuss the things that are upsetting them the most.
I just want to repeat a few of those points because that felt like a very important answer to me. Creating that safety net for boys and men to express their emotions, making them feel safe and they can open up, validating those feelings as well, and making them feel heard. I think almost if nothing else, I think if people can take something away from this episode, and there'll be lots, but I think that is very powerful, because I can relate to that a lot in my own life, and also people that I know as well. And I hadn't really actually thought about it in that way before. So I think that's very, very powerful advice.
And I would add that this is something that's important for men to get in their relationships, in their romantic relationships, trans, gay, straight, it doesn't matter. because regardless of gender identity, this is a very universal response and feeling for a lot of males who identify as male. And so they don't feel that they have safe spaces. There are so many men in relationships, and to some extent it's true in gay relationships, but especially in heterosexual, in straight relationships, where a lot of men feel that they can't go to their female partner because even though sometimes the female partner says, I want you to be vulnerable with me, I want to know, I've had so many psychologists I've interviewed say that at a certain point, when men are vulnerable, their partners sometimes will start to get uncomfortable with it. And they will say things like, I didn't know you were so needy, or, could you just dial back a little bit on that? That kind of message, even to a grown adult male, it feels like shame and it shuts him back down again. And so it's really important for us as men to be, to have people in our lives that will not ask us to minimize our emotions once we learn, to feel more comfortable in our vulnerability. We need to know that there are safe people we can be around who will validate these things and encourage them. So it's especially for boys, but even if we didn't get it as boys, we need to learn about this as men and to have a person or people in our life who can give us this safe space too.
Andrew, is there anything that we haven't discussed today? Something really important that we really should have done?
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned at the outset, Simeon, is that this idea of resiliency is a huge one, and there is all these metrics for gauging resiliency, and some of the most common ones, the ability to regulate emotions, the ability to move on, after you've encountered obstacles. Some of these really common metrics that we use to gauge resiliency are lacking in so many boys and young men today. And that is why as I mentioned earlier, we can look at school because boys and young men spend so much time, in that's kind of their job. When you look at schools, that's really the place that we can see where boys are succeeding and struggling because, that's where they're doing their job. And it's not a coincidence that on every metric of conventional success for education, girls are outpacing boys. And we talk about things like literacy levels. I mean, that starts off at about third or fourth grade. It goes all the way through the end of high school into university, handing in assignments, completing assignments on time, grade point averages. A lot of boys and young men can still do well on standardized tests. They can show up for the big game. But when it comes to the day in and day out grind of showing up and doing the work, that's where a lot of boys and young men fall short. And that even occurs in a lot of a lot of boys' schools, where parents are paying a lot of money. A lot of teachers still see that kind of behavior. And the difference is that when they're home or in this school where they're paying a lot of money, the teachers can kind of come together, swoop in, and recognize the problem, and they can really help the boy. But when a lot of these boys get out of the house, if they go on to university, a lot of them are thrown through the cracks again. And so this is really a much bigger issue of resiliency that we're seeing. And one of the common narratives that we have about mental health with males is that, oh, well, the big problem is that they won't seek help. That is part of the problem for a lot of us. A lot of us will not seek help. But there's an undiscussed, misunderstood part about mental health in males that really does not get talked about. It's not just that we won't seek out help. It's that when we experience symptoms of anxiety and depression, they go underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. And that is far more common in males than it is in females because the metrics that a lot of healthcare practitioners use to gauge anxiety and depression are metrics that they use that are more common as they manifest in girls and women. And so practitioners some of them are just starting to learn what are the externalized behaviors for boys and men with anxiety and depression. And a lot of them haven't really even caught up yet. And so when we talk about resiliency, that's another important part of it, is that we've got to have healthcare practitioners who can pick up on very common symptoms as they manifest in boys for things like chronic anxiety or mounting depression, because that's another important component of resiliency that really is getting overlooked right now.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining today. I've taken a lot from this conversation, both as a father and a man, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to will have done the same as well.
Thanks so much for having me, Simeon. It was great.